McArthur, and it's a great pleasure to be here today to talk to you about the tradition of ningyo, or dolls, which is a very broad tradition in Japan. They are known throughout the world for their beauty. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to share my screen so that you can start looking at one of them. Here we are. And they're famous throughout the world for their beauty, and they're so carefully created with their porcelain heads. You can see porcelain heads and hands and silk hair and clothing made out of silk brocade and other very fancy cloth. That they're really typically, the most famous types of dolls are typically really more for display than for play. But there are certain types of dolls that can be played with as well and have been traditionally. There's so many different types made from all the different materials you can imagine, from silk, from porcelain, from other types of clay, from paper mache, folded paper, and now plastic. So we'll be looking at some of the different types in the lecture today. Now, these Japanese dolls are really quite a pervasive aspect of Japanese culture. They are made throughout the country and have many different forms. And they're one of the themes of the Japan Foundation's Doors to the Arts of Japan series of videos that they produce. And I find these videos very interesting and helpful in my understanding of Japanese dolls. There's also the chance in these videos to see some doll makers creating the dolls, and I love that. I always enjoy seeing the artists at work. Now, in my mini lecture today, I'm going to be giving a very brief introduction to some of the dolls featured in the videos, and to one additional type of doll that I encountered as a child, as a very young child. So it was my very first, not only my first introduction to Japanese dolls, but my first introduction to Japanese art. So you could say that that started me off on my career as an art historian. So I will be sharing that doll with you as well. I'm also going to introduce the very unique dolls that are made by a Japanese doll maker who I've been working with recently. And I've worked with her to curate an exhibition of her dolls that is currently being exhibited in Los Angeles. This is her first exhibition in the United States. So I feel very proud and honored to have worked with her on this project. So I'm going to give a little bit of background in the history of dolls, although it's not a subject that's very widely known about. It's also not a subject that art historians tend to have focused on, because for much of many art historians think of dolls as just toys, not necessarily art. So they haven't chosen to study dolls. And I feel I'm one of those art historians who hasn't devoted a lot of time to dolls, but recently I've become a lot more aware of their importance in Japanese culture and also in Japanese art history. And the very earliest dolls that were made in Japan date back as far as the 7th century, we believe. And very early dolls were basically made of strips of wood. You can see here some examples, and they were painted with very simple faces and other features. And these dolls were not playthings. They actually had a spiritual significance. They were created to take the place of a human being, and so that they could suffer calamities and disasters instead of humans themselves. So apparently they were blown on, and then they were floated down the river to take the suffering away down the river with them. And so they were basically a proxy for human beings, and to absorb suffering and pain. And this is an example here of a slightly later type of doll that was made by when a baby was born in the imperial court, and it's called an amagatsu. And it was basically a frame, and it was dressed in clothes, and it was supposed to take the place of the baby, so that any sort of evil forces that were going to send disaster and calamities towards the baby would send it to this doll instead. So it absorbed all of the calamities that might have befallen the child. So it was, again, a substitute for the child. It wasn't a plaything. It had a much more spiritual function. Now, it's believed that the first example of playing with dolls, or hina asobi, not ningyo asobi, but hina asobi, dates back to the Heian period, so about 1,000 years ago, a little bit more, when it's believed that members of the imperial court played with Hina, these dolls. And this is a 19th century painting of what it might have looked like to for people in the imperial court in Kyoto to be playing with dolls. These look like just miniature versions of the of the courtiers themselves. We don't know exactly what these early Hina dolls would have looked like. But this is a nice image to have in our minds of how they began their history. This is what Hina dolls look like today. These are the most well-known type of Japanese dolls around the world. These are dolls that have porcelain faces and hands, and they don't have a full body underneath those clothes, but they are covered in layers and layers of kimonos of the type that would have been worn by courtiers in the Heian court over 1,000 years ago. And these robes were made to look very similar to the types of robes that court ladies would have worn, and court gentlemen too. And we think that Hina dolls have their origins in the Hina dolls that were played with by the imperial courtiers, but we're not completely sure of when they were first made and first used. But it seems that they were actually playthings. Now, the Hina dolls that we know today, that we're familiar with today, and the tradition of displaying Hina dolls is a tradition that goes back to the Edo period, so much later than the Heian period. So it probably started around the 17th century. These dolls were dressed to basically look like the emperor and the empress and the imperial court, members of the court. They were basically supposed to be miniature versions of the imperial court. And they were actually very popular with the ordinary people of the cities, and they would basically reenact what they thought the imperial court looked like with these dolls. And and during this time, the dolls became associated with the Dolls Festival that's held on the third day of the third month, and it's still held on the third day of March today, and it's associated with girls, Hina Matsuri, the Dolls Festival. And during the Dolls Festival, these dolls are displayed to pray for the health and growth of girls. And so we associate these Hina dolls with the 3rd of March and with girls and the celebrations of girls. In sometime around the late 18th, early 19th century, the tradition of displaying these dolls on these these shelves, in a display called dan kazari, or shelf display, it took off. And so since then, it's been a tradition to basically set up, recreate the imperial court with the emperor and the empress at the top, and various ladies in waiting and musicians and guards and various paraphernalia related to life in the imperial court here in the lower shelves. So this is an example of dan kazari, which is something that you can see quite often in Japan today, especially in the homes of wealthier families. And in fact, when I lived in Japan, I lived in a city called Hita in Oita Prefecture in Kyushu, and there was a house called the Kusano Honke, and they had one of the most famous displays of dolls from the Edo period that had been passed down through the family for several hundred years. And every year on the third day of the third month, they would display dolls in a very spectacular dan kazari, much more complex than this, with many antique dolls that belonged to their family. And people would come from all over Japan to see them. So that was my first real interaction with the Hina Matsuri and dan kazari displays of these Hina dolls. The Hina dolls are also known as dairi ningyo, so Hina ningyo or dairi ningyo, and the dolls that were made in different parts of the country were named after those places. And this pair, this emperor and empress, are called Nagoya ningyo because they were made in Nagoya, which is a city that is famous for its dolls. And you can see there's very elaborate embroidery here, and the headdress of the empress here is very ornate. These are some of the most beautiful examples of Hina Ningyo. Now, just so the boys don't feel left out, there are actually ningyo that are made to celebrate the health and growth of boys as well. And these are dolls called Gogatsu Ningyo. And Gogatsu means the 5th month, which is now May. And on the 5th day of the 5th month, there is a boys' festival, now Kodomo no Hi, or Children's Festival. And on this day, you can, there are many different things that are take place, like the hanging of the koinobori, the carp streamers, but you can also display dolls that they're basically for boys, and they are often dressed as samurai, and they're made to look very strong, powerful, and brave. So this is an example of a Gogatsu Ningyo. So it's related to the Hina Ningyo, but this one is specifically for boys. Slightly different tradition. And these dolls are Ichimatsu Ningyo, which are related to Hina Ningyo, but as you can see, they're made in the same way, with the same sort of porcelain faces. They've actually got inlaid eyes, silk hair, and miniature kimonos, but they are made to look like children rather than the emperor and the empress and the imperial courtiers. And these dolls were quite precious as well, but they could actually be played with, and they were typically dress-up dolls. Families would, the mother, usually the woman of the house, would recycle scraps of kimono fabric and make dolls, clothes for the dolls out of them, just as people have been recycling fabric to make dolls for clothes in many parts of the world. So this is the Ichimatsu Ningyo, which is also very collectible today. Sorry, my cat is trying to get into the Zoom. I'm so sorry. He will probably make an appearance any second now. This is a type of doll called a Saga Ningyo, and it's these were originally made out of wood. And this doll on the left is an old Saga Ningyo made of wood and decorated with pigments and gilding. And it's believed that Saga Ningyo were first made by sculptors who made Buddhist statuary for temples. And they started to make dolls as well using the same skills. Just as they would actually start carving small netsuke when netsuke became popular. Woodworkers in Japan have been very versatile over the centuries. The doll that you see on the right here is a contemporary Saga Ningyo made by an artist in Kyoto, who actually, she doesn't carve the wood, but she makes these dolls out of a paste called toso. And toso is made of sawdust, specifically the dust of certain types of wood, like paulownia, for example. And it's mixed with glue. And it is then basically, it hardens and it's carved into the shape of these dolls. And then it's coated with pigment and gilded. Excuse me. And this is an image of the artist painting in the eyes of the dolls, which is one of the hardest parts to do, but it's also one of the most important parts because it brings the doll to life and makes it seem real, and you can have eye contact with the doll. Now, this one is part of a very different tradition of doll making from, this one is from Fukushima. It's a Hariko doll. And these Hariko dolls are made of papier mache. So they're basically made of wet paper that is pressed into a mold. Usually these molds have been passed down from generation to generation in the doll making families. And they are made into many different forms. This is a kabuki actor, and you can see he's been shaped into the form of a kabuki actor, but he's also been painted and decorated with very vibrant colors. And these are considered more folk art than playthings now. They're often souvenirs from tourists, and they have been for quite a long time. Now, these are one of the most popular types of dolls. These are Kokeshi dolls, and they come from northern Japan, from the Tohoku region. And they've been popular since the 1800s. These are one of my favorite types of Japanese dolls. I actually have a Kokeshi doll that I've treasured for many years. I got as a student when I was studying Japanese. And these dolls they have an interesting, a very unique form. They are basically tall cylindrical dolls, usually with a head that's attached. Sometimes they have different styles and different shapes and decorations depending on where they're made and which artists made them. Many different styles. But typically they have a head that's attached, inserted into the body, but some of them are one single piece, so the head's part of the body. And sometimes the heads can twist and so that they make a popping sound or they squeak to make them more entertaining. But typically they're basically carved on a lathe. You can see an artist working on one here with a chisel, carving away the dolls, the shape of the doll, so that it's very smooth in the end. It's very smooth, and it when it's played with and cherished over the years, it becomes smoother and smoother, and it develops a really beautiful warm appearance. These Kokeshi dolls it's thought that they originated in hot springs, where the farmers would work hard throughout the year and then they would go to hot springs to rest and heal their aching bodies. And the owners of the hot springs would sell these Kokeshi dolls, and the farmers they would buy them and take them home to their children, and the children would play with them. So these are a type of doll that was traditionally played with. Although over recent years, I don't think many Japanese children are particularly interested in these dolls anymore. And they become much more, again, tourist souvenirs, but also collectible items, especially the vintage ones. And some of them are quite valuable now if the original maker was important and is identifiable. These are some images of the doll makers applying the facial features on the kokeshi. Usually they're painted with very bright colors, although some are just black and mine is a monochrome version, which I think is particularly lovely because it's such a simple, very kind of wabi or shibui doll. It does actually have a signature on the base, so I do need to find out who made my kokeshi doll. They have very bold floral decorations on the bodies, typically. And here you have a whole row of kokeshi dolls made by the same artist, but since they're all hand painted individually, no two kokeshi dolls are identical. They're not factory made, they're handmade. So folk art, but also I think they're works of art, period. And now this is a type of doll that I encountered when I was, I think, about 8 years old. This is the actual doll that I was given by a pair of Japanese women when I was a child. And this is a type of doll called a Chiyogami NINGYO. And Chiyogami is a decorative paper, handmade paper that is usually printed with very beautiful designs that look often like kimono fabric. Use and dyed kimono fabric. And this paper is often used to decorate various boxes and used for origami by many people. This type of Chiyogami NINGYO is usually made by folding this decorative paper and then into a body and then inserting a head with a beautiful wig into the body. And they're only about this size, they're very small. And this particular Chiyogami NINGYO was made by a family, the Isetatsu family in Tokyo. I finally was able to read the information that came with the doll. I couldn't read it when I was 8 years old, but later I became an art historian and I read the label and learned that it was made by a 4th generation Chiyogami family. They made the papers and then they made dolls with the paper. And there are many different types of paper dolls in Japan that I think are fascinating. Some of the Chiyogami Ningyo makers, they also make bookmarks. I'm sure many of you who've been to Japan have seen the bookmarks in a lot of tourist shops. I have always succumbed to purchasing these bookmarks because they're just so appealing, and what nicer way to be invited into your book after you've after you've stopped reading it for a while. And this is a very different type of doll. This is an example of a very modern Japanese doll. This is Lika, or Rika, Licca, when Romanized. And she was a doll who basically was introduced in 1967 and became hugely popular. And she's still made today. She is sort of the equivalent or the Japanese version of a Barbie doll, but she's a girl rather than a voluptuous woman. She's a young girl with big eyes, and she has features very like the features of girls in anime and manga. And she became hugely popular. She came with different clothing, different accessories, her own home, family members, friends, and she sold in the millions, and became a best-selling commodity. And she, as I said, she's still made today. She's still made today, and she's still very popular. But there are other types of dolls that have also that are also sold in Japan. Possibly the Japanese Barbie doll. This is not a Japanese doll, but I couldn't resist because of the popularity of Barbie, the resurgence in Barbie in the last few months. I couldn't resist looking up some models of Barbie dolls. This is from 1984, and this is Barbie in 1995. Supposedly the modern Japanese woman, I guess. But they are quite lovely, and part of the Dolls of the World series by Mattel. Just thought I would throw these in for fun. Now I'm going to end on something completely different and exquisitely beautiful. These are the dolls of Kimiko Muraoka Koyanagi, who's the artist I've been lucky enough to be working with for the last couple of years to prepare an exhibition of her work, her first exhibition in the United States. And she is a doll maker, third generation doll maker from a family, the Muraoka family in Tokyo, who've been making dolls for about 100 years, more than 100 years. And she learned doll making techniques from her family with her siblings, with her 7 siblings. There were 8 kids all, and they were all taught how to make these dolls. And she she and her sister both live in Southern California now, but she has developed her own unique, she's modified the family technique. So because she's lived in North America for most of her adult life. So she had to create dolls that could survive in a much drier climate than in Japan. So she modified the technique so that her dolls would survive. And she, how they're made is that she creates a wire kind of core, and then she covers it in this torso, which is the paste that's made of paulownia wood shavings and mixed with glue. And she coats the wire core with that to create the human form. And then she makes layers of it and then carves it into the form she wants, and then applies coatings of what she refers to as Chinese white, which is basically gofun, a powder that is made of, a pigment that's made of powdered shells. So it's a white pigment, and it is, she mixes it with paste and then applies several coats of this pigment to create the doll's skin. And then she mixes in other colored pigments with the gofun or she paints watercolor onto the gofun to create the colors. She doesn't use a lot of colors. Many of her dolls are actually black and white with a little bit of pigment on the lips and eyes. But some of them have blue clothing or red. We have examples of white white, black, red, and blue dolls in the exhibition. And they're all exquisite. They're about something like 15, 16 inches high. They tend to be very tall and slender, and they have a very sort of girl-like innocence. To her, these dolls are beautiful because of their innocence and their purity. To her, they're very spiritual. They're not just dolls, but they encapsulate a lot of spiritual qualities, and her ideas about the world and the way we live our lives. So these are two examples of the dolls that we have currently on display. And it's been a real treat to be able to work with a doll maker. It's really changed the way I look at dolls. Her dolls, of course, are very much closer to the world of sculpture than toys. And I really have gained a lot more respect for dolls and doll makers since I met her. These dolls typically took about 2 months to make. They're very simple looking, but they're actually the process of layering, creating the form, and then fine tuning it and perfecting it, and then applying the pigments and letting each layer dry takes about 2 months. And now Koyanagi-san is 91 years old. So she says she can't make them that fast. So each doll's probably going to take more like 3 or 4 months. But she's promising to keep working at making these dolls so that she can, and she wants to introduce them to as many people as she can. She is the last, there isn't anybody learning the technique anymore. So she may be one of the last makers in this tradition. So it's really been an honor to get to know her. I'm going to end here with a plug again for the videos that you can find on the Japan Foundation website, and Doors to the Arts of Japan. NINGYO, that's our word of the day. And you can learn about the Hina NINGYO and some more about the Saga NINGYO, Kokeshi, and some of the other traditional dolls made in different parts of Japan.